Welcome to Old Path and our Thursday study through the New Testament. We make it to the book of Revelation today, and I have been very much looking forward to doing this. It's such an interesting time in human history. So much is taking place around us right now, especially as far as the Middle East is concerned. There's just a lot that's taking place. Before I could actually, though, dive into any of the text, there's a lot that we kind of need to do in the way of kind of defining terms a bit. And so I want to be able to do that kind of right at the front of all of this. Now, we'll get into a bit of an outline in very, very vague ways, just kind of biggest of the big picture of things. But I'm going to start with putting up an image here. This is the timeline that we would see from the time of Daniel's 70th week prophecy, or 70 weeks prophecy. Begins at verse 24 of Daniel chapter 9, and it, I believe, concludes at a time even future to our day, though I feel like we're getting closer there every single day. Now, one of the things that you'll see as we start to put up some of these various terms that we want to define, you're going to see that there is not necessarily kind of a unanimity as far as the as far as this book is concerned, and I find that to be a pretty fascinating thing. Because of all the different views that there are of how to read and interpret this particular book, there really isn't but a handful of books that are so thoroughly attacked. And in this case, the book of Revelation, I believe that there's been absolute violence done to this text to make people's view of the way that things are fit their narrative rather than just let the scripture speak. When I start to think of books that are attacked like this, there are only 66 books in the Bible, and the book of Revelation is one of those books, and I only put one other in that same category, and that being the book of Genesis, that are so roundly attacked by liberals within the church. And people that we'll get into why I think some of the people have come to the conclusions that they have through the centuries, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But I think that there's a bigger picture to this that we ought to consider, is why would people, especially liberals within the church, attack the book of Genesis and attack the book of Revelation as they do? And I've held this view for a number of years, and I believe it's this: if you can attack the book of Genesis and attack the book of Revelation and try to cast doubt on the veracity of them and the legitimacy of them, and try to make them say things that they don't, then you get a chance to really kind of rewrite all the pieces in between. So I kind of think of them as like the pillars on either side of a bridge that uphold everything in between. So if you could disassemble or damage either one of the book of Genesis or the book of Revelation, you kind of cave in everything in between, and you begin to do damage to every single one of the books in there. So you'll find that the general consensus among the liberals, that you'll find people that don't believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible, they'll attack the book of Genesis about whether or not there was a literal 7-day creation, or 6 actual days of creation and a 7th day of rest. They will attack then from that point on. They'll attack the actual literal fall and all of the consequences of that. Chapter 3 of Genesis, the idea of a global flood. If think about this, if you can attack the global flood, you attack the necessity for it. And so sin is not something that is judged. As you go on further through the book of Genesis, when you start to cast doubt on the veracity of it, then the promises of Israel through the person of Abraham, that comes under attack. And then fast forward into the New Testament, the book of Revelation, if it's not literal, then you can start to do all kinds of violence to it. So I'm going to get into some of the different views that there are on that, and define a little bit of the terminology just so that we understand. Because if you're going to spend some time studying into this book beyond just what I'll be presenting in these weeks as we go through this, and you start to read what people have to say on it, you're going to start to see a lot of terms that are used that, if we're not real clear on it, can kind of be a little bit of, they could be a little bit on the confusing side of things. So as I have this timeline up here, I believe that this is a good representation of everything from the time of Daniel's 70th week, or 70 weeks prophecy. Again, as I had mentioned earlier, chapter 9 of Daniel, starting at verse 23, 69 of those 70 weeks were fulfilled at the triumphal entry when Jesus came into the temple And when we get to Daniel eventually, down the road, I'm going through the Old Testament now. We're currently in the book of Psalms. But once we've moved through that and we get through the prophets, I'll get to Daniel, and we'll go through that particular prophecy if the Lord still has us here by then. So anyhow, what ends up happening at the end of that 69th week, Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and as Daniel records, he is cut off from among the living. And then there still remains this time waiting on the 70th week. Now, interpreters of the Bible who don't take the literal view as I do will try to find a way to fit that other last unresolved 7 years after the triumphal entry of Jesus, and they'll try to fit it somewhere historically. And you'll find that that's kind of that mentality of trying to make things fit is why you find the difference of the views of interpretation of the book of Revelation. Rather than let it speak in literal terms, what I believe is that the 7 years are still left to be resolved. So what is that interval from the 69th to the 70th week is what we call the church. And again, you have that in this timeline that's here. What we have left for us is that 7 years. Now, the book of Revelation covers that 7 years, and it actually gives you the numbers that make that work. It shows that there are 7 years that the book of Revelation covers. And so, again, unresolved in Daniel's time, but resolved as John gets the revelation of this and begins to kind of unpack what is going to be taking place future to our time, an imminent event. And so we'll get into what all of that is. We believe that as Daniel sees that 7th week, there is an event that happens midway through those 7 years, the revelation, or the revealing rather, of the Antichrist, and what will end up ultimately being a time of what is a world dictatorship and forced religious affiliation with the Antichrist. Chapter 13 of Revelation, we will end up getting there shortly. There is again the millennial reign, which begins at chapter 19, I believe, and I'm kind of doing the introduction to the book of the chapters, but I'll do a little bit more on that here in just a moment. But then there is from chapters 21, pretty much there's an overlap, the end of chapter 20 into 21. But 21 and 22 is the everlasting kingdom after the 1,000 years are over. And we're going to get into all of this as we work our way through the book. But let me give just some other things that we can take a look at, which I think are very important. And that would be the opening words of this is the apocalypsis, or the revelation. The Greek word is the apocalypsis. And so it's the revealing or the unveiling. And interestingly enough, this is when Jesus comes back to the earth that we see in chapter 19, but he is also actively involved in the judgments that are taking place on the earth. We know that because of some of the things that are said in the 6th chapter of Revelation, where the people are crying out and saying to the rocks to hide them because of the wrath of the one who sits upon the throne and the Lamb, speaking of Jesus. So they know where this is coming from. So actively he's involved in some way that they recognize, and we'll get to all of that when we get to those chapters. But there's so much, again, I think that we really need to unpack before we get to that point. Now, we are also told, as we read in the first parts of this, in fact, let's look very, very briefly at Daniel chapter 12. And I want to point out one thing that we see, because this helps us to understand that from the time of Daniel's writing until the time of John's writing, there was a break, if you will, in the revealing of all of these things. So we read in verse 4 of Daniel chapter 12, it says, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until..." And what is that until? Until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. And he repeats that later on in this same chapter, but you can read the close of the chapter from verse 4 all the way through verse 13 as Daniel closes. Now, with that in mind, notice what you see in verse 19 of Revelation chapter 1. It tells us this. It says, "Now write." In contrast to what Daniel is told, close the book. There's nothing more to be revealed until the latter days, until the end of times. That's when these things can be revealed. And so what we understand is the end times really begins at the church. And so people would say, well, how can that be the end times? That's 2,000 years. Well, you're thinking of it in the linear sense of how a human thinks, that 2,000 years to us seems like a very long amount of time, but as far as God is concerned, it's kind of the last of the way that he's dealing with humanity, and that's during the time of the church. And that will wrap up when that is over and the church is gathered to him. I take the not only the future view of the book of Revelation, but also I believe in the rapture of the church. So important that, and again, we'll be able to get into a lot of this information as we go on. So Daniel's told he's going to reveal things in the latter times. Here John is told, now write. Daniel's told to stop writing, shut the book, and John here is said, open the book back up and begin to write, because here's what's going to take place. Write these things which you have seen. This is what you'll see as far as chapter 1 is concerned. That's the things that are that have been seen. And then the things that are, which is really kind of more the churches. Churches in chapters 2 and chapter 3, and the things which will take place after, and this is kind of the outline that we've been talking about, which really covers the things that shall be, is pretty much chapter 4 through the end of the book, though I would put it this way, chapters 4 through 19 is the judgment that is still future to this time. At chapter 19, Jesus returns. Chapter 20 covers the 1,000-year, the millennial reign of Jesus, and then chapter 21 and 22 deals with the forever kingdom. So in the most broad sense, that's kind of the outline that is given to us in the book of Revelation. So one thing also that we want to recognize, turn to the very beginning, the first verses of this book, again, the revelation or the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. And one thing that I started to point out, but let me finish that off, in the book of Luke, chapter 2, I think it's around verse 26, we read about a man named Simeon. And Simeon had been told by the Holy Spirit that he would not die until he had seen the Messiah, God's provision for the nation. And so as he sees Jesus being presented at the temple, he holds Jesus in his hands. Again, Mary and Joseph trusting him. It's an interesting thing, but doesn't give us a lot of details other than he looks to Mary. Actually, he makes a proclamation and he has some words that he exchanges with Mary. But he says about Jesus that this is a person who will be he will be to the glory of Israel, his people, but he's also going to be an apocalypsis to the Gentiles, an unveiling, a revealing. And interesting that at the beginning of his life, he's referred to as a revelation, an apocalypsis, an opening of an understanding, a revealing. And here now in the book of Revelation, we see that Jesus is now a grown man who has come and gone from the scene here on earth, but is in a heavenly sense now the one who will begin to have this role in speaking to the churches, because it's Jesus who gives that in chapters 2 and 3. And then he's actively involved in the events of chapters 4, culminating at his return at the end of chapter 19 and setting up a kingdom that he rules and reigns in chapter 20. So this fascinating future that is still to be revealed here on earth, again, because I take the view that these things are future. And so anyway, that's kind of the way that we will approach the book. And again, it's so badly abused by so many people because they refuse to believe in a literal view of the book of Revelation. So here's one very important rule of thumb as we move on. In chapter 4 of the book of Revelation, let's go there real quick, because as I'm about to explain and go through, there are people who will take the view of this book that it is supposed to be written in the sense of allegory or types or symbols and stuff like that. Now, there are times when we are going to look at things in the symbolic way. Look at what we see in verse 7. Here's just a great example. It says, now the first living creature, and we'll get into all of this description and the explanation of it as we get there when we get to chapter 4. I want to point out something that you see here. He sees these creatures. Now the first living creature was like a lion. The second living creature was like a calf. The third living creature had a face that was like a man. And the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. So you have these 4 descriptions, and it says in each one of those instances it was like, or it was similar to this. So there are times when it's impossible for John to give an actual example of something that can be seen in the world around them, because it just frankly does not exist. So he uses the term like. It's similar to this because I can't tell you something. None of us have ever seen anything like it other than what John sees in this vision, but none of us here reading this have ever seen what he's describing. So he says that it's like. So for those people that say, well, the Bible speaks in such ways that we can't understand fully what he's describing. Okay, great. So symbols, allegory, whatever you want to call it, when we get to those kinds of things, if it's something that we do not understand because we've never seen it with our own eyes, he's going to say it's like, or it's similar to these things. But that doesn't mean that we can take that view with the entirety of the Scripture. With everything that's here, just because he says it's like this, and he has to use something in a way of saying you'll understand kind of what it looks like based upon an eagle, a calf, whatever you want to say, but that doesn't mean that it opens it up to do that with the entirety of the book. So we want to be really, really careful how we approach the way that we look through the various aspects that we're discussing here. And as we approach the book, we want to make sure that I'm going to present it this way. Now, you can agree or disagree, that's your choice. I'm going to present what we read here with a future view of it. And I want to go through those various views because they're important. That's what you see being discussed. So let me change the slides. I want to start to define some terms. The first of the terms that I'd like to deal with is eschatology. And so we study what we call eschatology, but not everybody knows where it comes from. It's from the Greek eschatos, which means the last, and ology, which is the study of the topic or the thing. So theologically, it's used by Paul and others, meaning it's the last or the eschatos of days. You get that from 2 Timothy chapter 3. You'll also get it in Jude. We just finished. You got it with John. They talk about the last of time. It's really the eschatos is the last in a line of things. Sometimes it's the days, it's the times. It's just a way of saying there is a culmination to everything that we know of what is human history. So eschatos, once again, 2 Timothy 3:1, know this, that in the last eschatos days, perilous times will come. Interestingly enough, as you study this in Timothy, chapters 3 and 4, really kind of go through and tell us what the church age will be like before the return of Jesus. So notice what he says here, that know this, that in the last days, perilous times. It's a time within a time. Last days is what started from Paul's time. And so he's warning Timothy, and you don't warn Timothy unless you think those things are going to happen in your day. So as Paul lays out, the end times, as he sees it, the last days, are something that Timothy should be aware of. Not knowing how long it was going to take, but that was the beginning of the last days. He's not writing past Timothy to our day, 20 centuries later. Instead, he's writing to Timothy, assuming it's going to take place in his time. And so in that time of the last days, there will be times distinctly different. They will be perilous. And so that means vicious, ferocious. They'll be unlike anything that you've seen before. And he goes on to give that description in the verses that follow. So with eschatology, we move to dispensationalism, and I've just used some sources that people will recognize, so I've given the links for that. But a dispensation is just a way of ordering things. It's a way of saying administration or system. It's a management. And so in the study of how God does what he does, or what we call theology, a dispensation is a divine administration of a period of time. So when we look at the book of Revelation, it's a dispensation. After the church age comes to an end, then God is going to really culminate, if you will, what we see in the world around us, and it's the end of the existence of mankind as we know it. And at the end of it, what we know is that all rebellion and those unbelievers will be put away permanently, and we get into the eternal state of things without any corruption. That's what the Bible teaches. So, this dispensational is a theological system that recognizes these ages that were ordained by God to order the affairs of the world. Now, dispensationalism has two primary distinctives. This was what makes dispensationalism different than other views of how God deals with man. It is a consistently literal interpretation of the Scripture, especially when it comes to the matters of Bible prophecy. The book of Revelation, the book of Daniel, great examples of that. When the Bible says this is going to happen later in time, we don't try to find a way to fit it historically. Unless it fits perfectly, we don't try to make it fit. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go on, as we look at the different views of this. So the second of these, it views the church's uniqueness, it's a view of the uniqueness of the nation of Israel as separate from the church in God's program. And the easiest way to understand that is there's a promise that through Abraham, all of the nations and really the generations of mankind going forward for 4,000 years and counting, that they will be blessed because of the promise God made to Abraham. So that's in chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. That's before he ever even entered into the land. He was still in Ur of the Chaldees when God promised him that, and he had no descendants, he had no children. They are decades down the road before that even begins to happen. We find that starts to take place in chapter 17 of the book of Genesis, and that is where he then says, it won't be Ishmael. By this time, God's already promised him a son, chapter 15, and he takes matters into his own hands at the behest of Sarah, his wife, only to have the incredible regret of taking Hagar and having through Hagar, not Sarah, a son named Ishmael. So when God says he's going to have this work done through Abraham and his descendants, Abraham says to God, let Ishmael then walk before you. And God says, no, it will not be Ishmael. It's going to be Isaac, born to you through Sarah a year from now. And that's, again, his name is Isaac. He knows all of that information. And he says, through him is going to come a promise that I'm going to give of the land, and they will be directly genetically tied, you through Isaac. So chapter 12, again, is the promise of eternal life, salvation through the person of Jesus Christ, and it has nothing to do with the land itself. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the DNA ties back to Abraham. It's to the whoever comes to faith through Jesus Christ. They are given that the promise, and this is what Galatians chapter 3 deals with. So we need to recognize that chapter 12 of Genesis is separate and distinct from the promise of chapter 17. Go look at them yourself. They are two entirely different things. There's really no controversy in this. So that's why we take the view that there is a uniqueness of Israel as separate from the church in God's program. And as I record this, there is all the craziness in our college campuses of the just Jewish hatred and the anti-Semitism that is rampant in our culture. What's really interesting about that, there are a lot of places on the planet that if they were really worried about atrocities and things happening to people, you don't need to go looking at what Israel's doing in Gaza. They don't even care about that, because if they were really worried about it, they would look back to the things that happened on October the 7th and not things that have happened since October the 8th. But the hatred towards Israel is absolutely, it's unhinged, and it has really no great context. So the only way that we can look at that and make any sense of it, we would expect there to be hatred of Israel because they are separate and distinct as a people, and they are God's chosen as far as that covenant is concerned. And so the hatred of Israel is a spiritual matter. There's no way to explain it any other way. Now, as we continue on through this, as we pass from dispensationalism, we come to premillennialism. Now, the millennium is a big topic. So the millennium really starts what we see in chapter 19 into chapter 20 of Revelation, when Jesus returns to the earth, and he begins the process of kind of weeding out those who have made it through the tribulation. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. There's a lot that we'll get to when we finally reach chapters 19 and 20. We're going to take our time in this study, needless to say. It's very important that we understand what the book is about. But when it comes to the millennium, that 1,000 years, some will take it literally, and for the ones who take it literally, they split into two camps. And the first is what we would call premillennialism, and that Jesus returns before he establishes the literal kingdom on earth, and he will reign with his saints in fulfillment of the Old Testament and New Testament prophecies. The reign on earth will last for 1,000 years. This is the view that I take, because I take the book of Revelation in a literal sense. Now, there are those who also would say that they take the Bible in a literal sense, but they would call themselves post-millennialists, and this is what they believe. Now, postmillennialism means this, that Jesus will return after the 1,000 years, which represents a golden age of unspecified duration. And so this is why you'll also find there's variations in this as well. Now, this age is ushered in by the triumph of the gospel as the world converts, in large part to Christianity through the efforts of the church. And this is why you'll find the people that Jesus returns at the end of it, but it's not really a literal time. And kind of hand in hand with this is a term that we refer to as amillennialism. And amillennialism is this meaning, it's whenever you see a in front of something, atheist, no theist, or no theism, no God. Theism is just God, the belief that there is a God. So atheism is a belief that there is no God. Millennialism, there is no literal 1,000 years. They take the view it's not literal. So again, these are the people that will look at the Bible, especially when you get to the point of Revelation, and they just don't want to take anything as being literal. They refuse, they reject that out of hand. They will not believe that for any reason whatsoever. And so they look at the whole of the book when it comes to the 1,000 years, beginning at what happens when Jesus returns in chapter 19. They just say it's not literal. We don't believe that to be a literal event. And so the 1,000 years is symbolic. They believe that we're currently in the millennium as they see it. So of course they will point to the length of time, because they believe, and I don't want to get too far ahead of us, because we will be dealing with the actual terminology in the first chapter, where amillennialism, I think, really runs into a brick wall. But again, when you do so much in the way of trying to do it as symbolic and allegorical, you can do some real violence to the text, which I believe that they do. So with all of that said, amillennialism is just that there's no literal reign of Jesus Christ over an earthly kingdom. So they believe that what you see in chapter 19 doesn't happen later on. They believe that in a symbolic way, that happened really kind of more along the time of when Israel was conquered by the Romans. And so we've been in the millennium, because it's not literal. So we've been in that ever since the fall of Jerusalem. And again, when you get to that point where it says, where we would say, well, when you get into chapter 19 and chapter 20, that Satan is supposed to be bound. And when you look at the world around you, it doesn't look like he is bound. The amillennialists would say, well, you're not looking at it right, because the binding of the devil is that God binds him or keeps him from preventing the church from being able to spread the gospel. So the church has had the ability to spread the gospel ever since the fall of Rome, and yet I don't believe that that's at all what was being intended, because yeah, you might be able to preach the gospel, but take a look around. The devil is winning the day. The actual genuine church that's regenerated by the Holy Spirit because of the blood of Jesus is a fraction. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny speck as opposed to the rest of humanity, because I don't care whose numbers you use. If we've got 8 billion people on the planet, even by the loosest of ways to try to define the term, only about 2 billion of those would even claim anything that resembles Christianity. So that basically means that 1 out of every 4 would claim anything that resembles Christianity, but I can show you a lot of people who are Christians that have no clue what that even means, let alone that they have come to an understanding of what it takes to be saved. So we'll be getting into all of that stuff as we work our way through the book. So this means that Jesus is presently, in the eyes of the amillennialists, he's presently reigning over a spiritual kingdom in either these different ways. Either in the hearts of men, or that he's reigning in heaven, or that he's reigning in and through the church. And the 1,000 years is really more of a symbol that represents some indefinite, extended period of time. They only know when it began. They have no clue when it will end, but it's been going on for at least the last almost 2,000 years. So this is what happens, though, when you take the interpretive view that the Bible's not literal in so many places. And I guess I have to ask the question, if you can take that view, then what prevents it from becoming more than just that? And where does it end? If you're going to take that kind of view of the of Revelation, you're going to have to be able to apply that to any book. And it is oftentimes that you see people take that approach, that it's really kind of left up to the individual, and they can look at a particular passage and say it's not literal. So if it's not literal and you're the one who determines that it's not literal, just think of how weird that ends up getting. So again, the book of Revelation and the book of Genesis are without question attacked more heavily than any other 2 books because they speak so specifically. 1, here's where you've come from. Here is what happens when a holy God has to judge sinful man because willfully they sin against him. And then yet even in the midst of that, God makes a promise that there is redemption through him, and it comes through the line of Abraham. That's the book of Genesis. Now, if you start to cast doubt on that entire book, think of what you can do to really the basic tenets of all of Christianity. Bookend that with the book of Revelation that tells you here's what God is going to do in the future, and people need to recognize that we're in those times. Our view, that's what I have. Now, if you're going to take the other view, it's amillennial, it's preterist, which is the next thing that we'll examine. I'm going to look at the main 4 views of the book of Revelation. It's kind of the presupposition that people have when they pick up the book of Revelation. They say, inside these chapters, here's what I'm going to find. I want to define those terms for you. But once again, if you have that view that none of this is in the future, then that changes the whole scope of what the church is supposed to do. And that's why you get into the people of the kingdom now theology that, we can't really get to the forever kingdom, whatever that may be, until we get the gospel preached into all of the world. And until we do that, the end can't come. They point to Matthew chapter 24, verse 14 for that. So interestingly enough, the people who believe that really have a very difficult time articulating what the gospel even is. I find that to be really ironic. So let's look at the 4 main views of this. So there is what we know as the preterist view, and I'm just going to put all of these 4 up. It's the preterist view, the idealist, or the idealistic, the historist, or the historical, and then the futurist. Now, there is one group that I'll throw in as well, because it kind of grabs from all 4 of the others. It's kind of a mishmash of the different ones, and it's referred to as the eclectic, and very few people really actually hold this, but there are times that you'll see a little bit of movement in between the camps, and hopefully that'll make sense as we get through this. Now, as far as the preterists are concerned, preter is the Latin meaning past, or in the big picture, if you say, if you want to try to identify what a preterist is, and if a person identifies himself, they say, I have the preterist view of the book of Revelation, then what that means is that for the most part, they're going to say everything that you see all the way up through chapter 19 really is, it's already been fulfilled. And so that's all historic. They basically look at that as being what happened at the hands of the Romans and at the conquering of Jerusalem in particular. And then if you want to extend it out, if you're kind of a history geek on that stuff, you can say all the way until the last of the displacements with Masada, 72, 73. And so they say basically for the last 2,000 years, that everything that the Bible talked about was really already concluded in the conquering by the Romans. Now, there is also a hyper group within this, or extreme in preterism, that really goes to the point of saying, since it's all past, then even the literal return of Jesus at the end of the millennium is also not literal, that there's no real physical return of Jesus to the earth. And again, that's getting to the point of absurdity. Now, the problem with this is that you start to take events that are described in the book of Revelation, and you try to make them fit some historical event that took place. Now, this, of course, they start to point to Nero, and that's, maybe even a little bit later. Some people even talk about preterism as it had its culmination during John's time at the end of the first century, but they believe that the book of Revelation, because of the events, if they're supposed to fit something that happened historically, then John must have written this somewhere in the mid-60s, like 64 or 65. I take the view that he wrote it after 90. So some 30 years later is when I believe, because he's looking back at, he would be looking back at the destruction of the temple, not looking forward to it. So the people who believed of the early writing, the preterists, would have to say that John was speaking predictively of the Romans. And again, the Romans missed so many bits and pieces of this being something that is a literal fulfillment at the hands of the Romans. We'll get into that when we get to chapter 3, and especially the book of the thing that was written to the church at Philadelphia. So we'll get to that in due course. But again, preterism is the belief that these things have happened in the past historically. And the kind of the middle of the road preterist believes that really nothing is left to be done except for the return of Jesus, and so they'll be in the post or the premillennial view that what we await right now is just the return of Jesus to the earth. At some point. And unless you're in the extreme version of preterism that doesn't believe in a literal return, that's a whole different kettle of fish. We won't spend a lot of time with them. Now, as far as the idealist or the idyllic view of this, they also look at it in the sense of it being symbolic. It's not historical, and there's really no fixed time frame to it. What it really teaches is more ideals or principles that are there. So the idea of the persecution of the believers, the difference between good and evil, or the fight between good and evil, they just look at it in the idealistic sense. So at that point, really pretty much all of that book, they're going to look at it as it's just, it's basically a motivational book, and it describes and explains the big picture things. Again, the struggle between good and evil and the judgment of sin and maybe those kind of things. Again, by the time that you get into this view of it, and if you're going to take that position on the actual book itself, just think of how much you might read into this. And the people who might take that view wouldn't have the slightest idea what exactly it is that they are reading. So this is where I think that it's really, really important that I'll just insert this here, that there are those people who will believe that you don't really want to study through the book of Revelation because it's so difficult to understand. And I've heard pastors actually say that. Now, these are the same pastors who don't have any problems preaching topically through a bunch of other books, which tells me that there's a spiritual issue that's going on here when you hear that kind of an excuse for avoiding a book that God says that there is a blessing that is implied. Let me read that for you. When you read chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show his servants the things which must shortly take place. And he sent and he signified this by his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, to all things that he saw. Now, here's the important part. Look at what verse 3 says. Now, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. And we'll get into about the nearness of time, which has so many people confused about this book. But notice what's here. That John, as he writes these things down, it's God speaking, says the person who will take the time to not only learn, but hold these things to themselves, that they will embrace what's here, there's a blessing that is given to them. God will bless those, and that implies a joyousness and a happiness in the person who reads. Now, how is it a joyful or a happy thing when you read about the destruction of humanity and the consequences of rebellion against God being put down in just unimaginable ways? How is that a joyous thing? The joyous thing is that God will finally put down all of rebellion. He will reconcile those who will come to him through the nation of Israel in those times as he judges the nations and Israel is brought to a place of reckoning. But the outcome of that is that all of man's corruption and sin and even the work of the devil will come to an end. And that's a blessing to know, because God is saying, here's how I'm going to end the things that we know, and here's how I will put an end to man's rebellion and lead to an eternity that is freed from any corruption. That's a joyous thing. Now, the word for blessed here, or that there's a blessing implied, is the exact same word that Jesus uses when he talks in the Beatitudes, is blessed are those who, and he gives those things, those who mourn, those who are persecuted. He gives all those different things. Blessed are the meek, all the different ones that you see there in Matthew chapter 5. So, with that being the understanding, we want to take a look at this book and say, for the person that takes the time to study and to learn and to know these things and to embrace what they say, it says God will bless those people. And that blessing is not something that's ambiguous. It's not as though we don't know where it comes from. It's that God says, if you're going to take the time to seek me out, I'm going to bless you in your pursuit. And it means simply that we're going to grow in our understanding of who he is and our relationship with him, because we know what's to come. This is an exciting thing for those who take the literal view of it, that we say, I hate the idea of the human toll, but I love the idea that God will put an end to all of man's rebellion and the consequences that come from it. We see it all around us, and I think anybody that's being honest will look forward to a time when none of this stuff is taking place. Now, the third of these is the historical view, or the historists. So they also look at it as it's symbolic, and it is seen in an allegorical sense, and it really kind of it covers the span of the whole of the Christian history. So it's not giving any specific things, but it's saying that whatever is being discussed, and again, I'm not going to go through all the different places where as they get to a particular chapter, they're going to say it fits this particular time in history. So and I know that some people kind of they take this approach when they start to study through the churches, and they say this church that's being spoken of here speaks to this particular era of time in human history, or in church history. And I know some people teach that. I've never been really all that persuaded in it, though you can say some similarities that are said to the church kind of explain a little bit about how things have happened traditionally. But there's no way that you can say let's just pick one of them. The church of Thyatira is from this time to this time, and then the church of Pergamos is this time to this time, or Philadelphia, Laodicea, any of those, that it covers this era of time. Why I don't agree with that is that you can find in any church today people that kind of fit by the things that they believe and the things that they espouse, different things that are said as cautions to those churches. And I'll make that kind of clear as we get to it. But anyhow, the people who take this, that it really looks more at a historical time. It's kind of like from the time that John wrote until our present day. And much of this view, it kind of looks at because it's written kind of from the perspective of the Reformation people. So Luther, I believe, held this, and a number of other reformers held this. So they look at the time of the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy as being, part of that era of time. And so they would look at the Roman Catholic Church, what you see there in chapters 12 and 13 of Revelation. They would look at that and say that era of time is speaking about the papacy, and them being the reformers are coming out of that time. So they really more look at the things that are explained in Revelation as fitting just specific eras of time, but they don't say it's from this date to this date. It's just more generalized than that. So it gives, you can kind of look at this and say, I can understand maybe perhaps in the absence of Israel actually being there in the land, you can start to get into this. Explains why there is replacement theology, but at the same time they're saying, well, if Israel's not in the land, then there's no way that we can take this literal, and they've been displaced for 1,500 years at the time of the Reformation, roughly speaking. So they may very well think that, well, they're not in the land now, so it must have been something. All of those promises about Israel really never were literal. They have to be somehow symbolic. And that's when you start down that road, where does it end? And who is it that arbitrates what is and what is not allegorical and what is and is not literal? It becomes a matter of the individual interpretation, and we know how dangerous that is. Now, there is the last of these, and I'm using this in the most general sense. Remember, I mentioned a group called the eclectic, and they kind of grab little bits and pieces. Now, again, I don't intend to do a deep dive on what preterists believe, idealists believe, the ones who believe it's a historic. I'm just kind of giving you a quick rundown, or even the eclectic. They're the least known of all of the views, but they take a little bit here and there, and it's a bit of a hodgepodge of all the different views. The last of these is the futurist view, which is what I hold, and it's how I will be teaching this book, and I'll do so unapologetically. I'll say it all up front. I'm going to take the view that this is being spoken of historically only when it comes to the matters of the churches, and that's chapters 2 and 3, and what John saw when he was seeing the things that he records in chapter 1. So by the time we get to chapter 4, I believe that is all future. And so everything from chapter 4 on to the end is all future and literal. And if there are things like I showed you in chapter 4, when John will say, well, it was like this, he simply isn't trying to use allegory or poetry or any other thing. He's just saying, I can't describe it to you in a way that you can go and look at it in the observable world. It's beyond our world. We've never seen anything like it. So that's when he starts saying it's like this. He's using symbols at that point because he has no better frame of reference, but it doesn't make it any less literal. It's just you can't see it with your own eyes anywhere here on earth, so you'll have to wait until you see it revealed, and then you'll understand. So that view is that all these things are yet future. So as we look at the book of Revelation, that is the way that we will approach the book, that these are things that are still future to our time. Now, once again, as we work our way through the book, again, there are plenty of places in here that are seen as controversial, and that's okay. Let them be controversial. Not everybody has everything absolutely right, and I'll be the first one to admit it. I won't say that I'm absolutely perfectly right on this, and I will disagree sometimes with people that I have a tremendous amount of respect for as Bible teachers, because it just is something like we're trying to study our way through a part of the book that's describing an era of history that is still to be revealed, and we've never seen anything quite like these things. So very, very important, and it really helps us to understand, I think, a little bit about the corruption that has made its way into the church. We get that in chapters 2 and 3. And I'll point this out because, again, this book, it really focuses heavily on the term or the matter of eschatology, the study of end things. And so if we're going to study the end of days, it does kind of have to include a number of different things, the condition of the church, that the writers, Paul, especially, but you get it through. We just finished with Peter, John, and Jude, and as far as those guys are concerned, they were talking quite a bit about the corruption that would make its way into the church and was already making its way into the church. And so much of what you see in Paul's writing, same exact thing. So if that's the case, and we survey at the end of the first century, I believe when John wrote this, Jesus gives his assessment of the churches, plural, the 7 of them, and 5 of the 7 have some systemic problem within the church. A couple of them are in absolute total apostasy. And so I want to make sure that we understand this. When it comes to the matter of the church, just because we call ourselves the church doesn't mean that we're free of corruption. And the best evidence of that is if the devil can corrupt the church in what is roughly 60 years. Remember, it's Jesus who gives the report card starting at chapter 2. And it's basically, if John's writing this in the 90s and Jesus died in the 30s, that's only 60 years of the church, and it's already 5 of the 7 are already in some state of corruption. So that just tells us that as time goes by, the devil gets better at what he does. Man gets more aloof, I think, and takes his eye more off the ball. So the idea that the church can fall into all kinds of corruption just makes perfect sense to me. So with all of that said, that will be the tack that we take in this. It also helps us to understand the world around us, and sometimes there are events that will be taking place that make absolutely no sense to us. Perfect example, the condition of what's happening in the world when it regards Israel and their time in the land, and the kind of just vitriol that we see taking place and the absolute hatred of a group of people that really the people who hate them probably don't even begin to ever ask themselves, why do I hate these people so much? And we understand it's because of suggestion. We've seen the things happening when people are looking at the protests that are taking place, and when they're asked questions, why are you here and what is it that you believe, they don't have a clue. They're just whipped up into a frenzy by other people. They don't understand the topic at all. Again, they look at the world through the lens of everything from October the 8th onward. They refuse to look at what happened on October the 7th and who did what they did, and that Israel has to root out Hamas, and Gaza needs to be cleared out, or else it will happen again. And until people wrap their minds around that, they'll never understand what's going on there. So frustrating to watch, and the ignorance is on full display everywhere that we see, frustrating as it may be. But with our study here and the things that we're going to be looking through, I want to make sure that we take our time and do our due diligence to study through this book in its entirety. And if you have any questions on any of what I've said so far, or as we go through this book and we study through it in chapter and verse and we go all the way through it, I'm sure that there will be a number of different things that you will hear that you might want further information on. So I make the offer now. I'll probably be doing it every week. You are welcome to contact me through the ministry's website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And there is an email link that is there that drops down, and you can send those questions in through that email, and I will return an answer back to you pretty quickly. I do check it daily, so unless there are just a lot of things taking place, I usually can get back to those pretty quick. So we'll conclude here today. We'll begin at chapter 1, verse 1 next week. And I hope and pray that as we study through this, that your eyes are open to what God has to say in His Word, and that as we study it together, that we would all come to an understanding of the things that must soon take place. So we give thanks to God for giving us His Word, and I pray that He blesses our endeavor to know Him better and to know the world around us as we see it, and what pertains to our days here and now. So next week we will pick up at chapter 1, verse 1.